Welcome to Security Take Two. I'm Chester Wisniewski, and I'm here with my co-host, Ben Verscharen.
This is episode 7, where today we're talking about Uber, and it is April 2025.
Yeah, you say Uber, and I think of Uber Alles, which maybe is the wrong way to think about this, considering this is kind of the other direction in a way. But we were counting up the number of incidents that we're going to cover today in preparation for recording. And I think we landed on 5, so that's a lot of Uber.
Yeah, I totally agree. I should say, I wasn't too sure if I should disclose, my alignment with Uber. Early 2014 and 2015, I was a fresh parent, and I may have consumed Uber a little bit too much, although I will say that has declined to 0 in recent years. So I'm proud to say that, at the very least. So there was a little bit of disclosure I needed to give there. But it's the first time I think we've had to cull things off the list when it came to breaches when we started investigating, certain companies or breaches, correct?
Yeah, so we don't usually get into the background of our podcast prep, but this one kind of called for, we actually had to have a pre-meeting and talk for an hour to figure out which things to include and which things not to include. So back to full disclosure, what we've chosen to include are incidents that were external threat actors stealing information or breaking into systems belonging to Uber. We did not include privacy violations that did not involve third parties, meaning internal employees abusing access to tools or information they have access to.
Correct. And today, the timeline, correct me if I'm wrong here, Chet, but we're going to go chronologically for breaches and settlements with the FTC. Is that correct?
That's the idea. Now, my chicken scratches that are guiding us to the official timeline may lead us astray as we're trying to remember exactly how to cover this with all of our notes. But that is certainly the plan. And with that, I guess we start, again, skipping the privacy thing. So we're not going to get into the God view and these kinds of things where, Uber staff may have tracked people and things like that. So the first breach that I was able to discover goes back to May 12th of 2014, right around the time that you might have been binging some Uber services. Impacted 100,000 people. And it was because they were storing a bunch of sensitive information in plain text on an AWS 3 share. And more to the point, the keys were leaked from a GitHub repo. And worse than that, the key that was leaked was kind of I hate to use this is going to come up a lot in this podcast, an Uber key. They only had one key with full access to the data, and they did not have different keys provisioned to access that S3 repo for different applications or different users with different privileges. It was just one key that they copy and pasted into everything that they used, and unfortunately that got synced to GitHub. Now, you're a GitHub user, Ben. I know, you've been a software developer. I'm not. I've written some rudimentary Rex scripts for my Amiga in the late 1980s, but I don't think that counts. How common is this, and how do you go about preventing this kind of thing? I mean, it seems like this is a sandwich of problems, right? We had unencrypted data in a bucket with an Uber key that controlled it, and then it got synced to GitHub.
Yeah, great question. So how common is it for secrets to end up in GitHub? Let me answer that one first. The answer is common enough that there are so many plugins available now for GitHub to actually scan pull requests. So that's a request that says, hey, I've committed this code and now I want to make it available to the world or available to the main branch that people can access. There are enough plugins available to actually scan repositories now to look for passwords, look for AWS secrets, and alert you to whether you've got secrets that are about to be committed and become public. And you can also do what's called a pre-commit hook, which pretty much runs on the developer's computer that says, hey, I'm going to run this script prior to allowing you to put any code publicly or available to other users even within your organization. And I'm going to validate to make sure that these keys that could potentially cause harm are not available. Now, admittedly, this was a public GitHub repository. And for those of you that aren't in software development and don't know about GitHub, GitHub is where most organizations store their code. It's owned by Microsoft, but a lot of people use it for personal use as well. A lot of their, scripts to automate their life, their home automation systems, even pet projects. So there's not a lot of detail about the GitHub repository that had the secrets in it. But for someone to say, write a script that, say, automated something as part of their job in AWS and accidentally commit that key either in the code base or an environmental file is incredibly common. And mistakes do happen. So I empathize with the software developer that had this slip up, but there are so many well-known ways now to deal with this. It shouldn't happen. Now, to end my little rant there, this did happen in May 2014. I'm looking at this as Ben from 2025 to say, well, this has happened enough times now that the systems around it go back 11 years and I can understand how this happened. However, having AWS keys with full access to a tenant is the problem here. The lack of security controls around keys and the fact that a developer has got the ability to commit keys and has access to keys to do whatever they want for an AWS account, Chet, that is a problem.
Yeah, especially one that's shared. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to the FTC's decision around this. Just to wrap up the 2014 breach, it did affect 100,000 people. It included banking information for 215 of them. Most of them were the names and driver's licenses of people providing Uber delivery services, or Uber drivers, if you will. So also included 84 social security numbers for some American drivers, and email addresses, cell phone numbers, and some trip information. So it was a hefty data set, but I have to, in fairness, point out that 100,000 sounds like a lot, but at a company the scale of Uber, it could certainly be worse, as we'll learn as the podcast continues.
Absolutely. So just to reiterate, there are so many things in place now in 2025 to prevent this kind of breach from happening, and it can happen. But then we move on, and then we've got October 2015 chat. And again, what happened to the poor Uber drivers?
Well, let's keep in mind that these are independent contractors. They definitely do not work for Uber. They are just Uber drivers. But their information was leaked again. And I know you have the notes on this. I did not find the story that you had found on this. How much information? I believe it was a much smaller number this time, was it not?
It was. So The Verge reported on October 14, 2015, that there was hundreds of drivers' personal documents exposed due to a software bug in Uber's partner app, which is something that their drivers were using. But there was certain conditions within the app that allowed you to view documents that weren't your own, but that of other drivers. And of course, that was then abused, and hundreds of drivers' details. And when I say details, I mean it's images of the driver, files that have been uploaded for validation, as well as driver's license, as well as social security numbers, vehicle registration documents, tax forms as well, so W-9s, which I believe are American, and additional other sensitive information. So there was a lot of PII exposed. It says approximately, actually, just reading my notes here, 674. All in all, you would say that this is relatively low impact, but that's a lot of PII available. Anybody could use that for identity fraud or theft. If I was one of those drivers, I would personally be quite miffed about this. I don't know about you.
Yeah, and just to point out for international listeners, since the majority of our listeners are not American of this podcast, if any of the stats I have are to be believed, because I respect people's privacy, we do not have trackers and things per se, but we do look at the IP addresses of downloads to get an idea for which country they're coming from. And so a W-9 form is a form you fill out when you are receiving money as a contractor, meaning you're not an employee of a company, that you submit to the IRS. You submit it to the company you're working for so that they can submit to the IRS saying, I paid Ben $52,000 for his ride shares this year, to be sure that Ben then has to pay tax on that money. So the importance of that is that it's every key piece of your identity needed to pay the taxes, which is exactly what an identity thief is going to be interested in. It's your social security number, your date of birth, your current permanent address, all the things that the government requires to submit tax information.
Yeah, and from a social engineering perspective, this is perfect, right? Because you could call up and say, hey, we're from the taxation office. We need to verify, say, banking details, and or any other wave of social engineering attack. And if you've got all of this information from vehicle registration to driver's license to the W-9 form, there's a lot of things you can use to validate and prove your identity on the phone as an attacker. So it wasn't a great one. And like I said, if I was a driver, I'd be pretty annoyed. But Uber's response, and I will give them kudos, like the moment that they knew about it, they fixed and patched it the same day. So it was resolved as soon as it was disclosed to them as well. They didn't sit on it for days. They didn't sit on it for weeks. And it looks like they did some retrospective looking into the logs, and so there was no indication of any further unauthorized use for this information. So relatively low impact when it comes to the amount of records, but it was a lot of high impact, personable, identifiable information, which is disappointing.
Well, I don't want to dwell on it, but let's talk about that response for just a quick second. In response to the breach in May of 2014 that we began the podcast with, Uber went and hired a chief security officer, and that chief security officer is a man named Joe Sullivan. And so I suspect that's why their ability to respond quickly and sensibly to the 2015 incident is because they had proper security leadership. Joe's a seasoned security leader. He formerly worked for Meta and as part of their legal team, but also had security responsibilities in addition to having been the former U.S. Assistant District Attorney for the District of Northern California. It does not roll off my tongue. But Joe's a very experienced leader, and so I think that's probably what helped the response to that 2015 breach, and he was brought on in the aftermath of the 2014 breach, which brings us to Joe some more in October and November of 2016. This is probably the one that a lot of listeners might be somewhat familiar with, or maybe very familiar, depending on how big of a hack nerds they are. But this one in particular was where Uber had another breach. In this case, it was 57 million records that were stolen by two hackers that were able to gain access to their systems. And the reason it was really well known and publicized when it was finally outed in 2017 by Bloomberg is that Joe Sullivan, the CSO at Uber, when he discovered it, went to the CEO, Travis Kalanick, the founder of Uber, to discuss this and how disastrous it was. They were under investigation by the Federal Trade Commission from the 2014 breach, and that investigation was not yet completed at the time that this hack happened. And him and Kalanick together apparently made the decision to call this a bug bounty payment and pay a ransom or an extortion fee to the criminals. The criminals had demanded 100,000 US dollars. And they decided, well, we'll just call that a bug bounty under our HackerOne bug bounty program, even though really it's extortion demand from a criminal who's stolen the data in order to kind of cover it up. But they really kept it quite hush-hush within Uber. It's some of the articles I read suggested that no one had even notified the chief legal officer. It was pretty much kept just between Joe Sullivan, the CSO, and Travis Kalanick, the CEO, and thought maybe by calling this a bug bounty, they could have it both ways, right? They could pay the criminals to go away and hope that they would delete the data and not have to disclose another serious breach. But I mean, 57 million records makes the 100,000 seem like, I mean, a bit insignificant.
Yeah, and it's worth noting here that this breach yet again happened via stolen credentials originating from GitHub. So AWS was again involved. So this data was on Amazon's S3 data storage. Credentials were obtained for that via GitHub, and it is believed that the attacker obtained the login credentials either via phishing or credential reuse to log into GitHub, to obtain the secrets, to log in to the Amazon S3 data storage, to then steal a ton of data. So it's incredibly similar to what we talked about in 2014. So over 2 years, they've already lost millions of people's records, and it was from very similar attacks as well, which is truly alarming there.
Yeah, I mean, the lack of encryption, and I don't believe, I didn't see any notes in any of the analysis I saw that suggested that they still had one key to rule them all. So at least they had some programs and protocols in place to do some privileged access management, those kinds of things. But it didn't stop the criminals from managing to get what they needed to still access all 57 million records. So we pause and take a detour in the timeline now. I mentioned that they were still under investigation from the 2014 breach. So after this, without disclosing it, the FTC finally ruled in the middle of 2017 on the 2014 breach and their investigation. They made it quite clear that Uber's track record, and we made mention of this earlier, of things like God View, which is the ability to like track Uber, people that have the Uber app, track their locations and things like this, had already left them rather unimpressed with Uber's privacy and security practices. But in addition to that, they noted in their findings that up until September of 2014, after the breach, that the reasons they were imposing penalties was that there was this one key to rule them all. There was no proper privileged access management. They were not using multi-factor authentication. They were not using any restrictions for employee access to PII. So in essence, every Uber employee could access any record that Uber had without any reason or need to know, as you might call it. They also had no security and privacy training whatsoever for their employees, and they had no written cybersecurity policy at all. And then up until March of 2015, they also had no encryption on their S3 buckets. So that was sort of the list of complaints from the FTC. As usual, I believe Uber admitted no fault, but accepted an agreement with the FTC to submit to 20 years of biannual security and privacy audits as a punishment, in addition to having to rectify that list of security failures that led to the breach.
Yeah, but at that stage, two other breaches had already happened, right? So, it's
they don't
a shame
know
the
that.
legal system's so far behind. Yeah, that's a good point. So,
and that's where the real trouble starts, right? I mean, so in November of 2017, Bloomberg broke the story that when the new CEO had started to replace, so Travis Kalanick was eventually booted by the shareholders, and they brought in a new CEO, Dana, and I'm going to butcher his name, but
I can't say it either, so please, you have to do this one for me.
Khogrowshahi, a fine Indian name. I'm sure this person has just as much trouble with Wisniewski as I have with his name. My apologies. He began as CEO, and once he was made aware of the 2016 breach with the 57 million records and the cover-up, he demanded Joe Sullivan's resignation, in addition to firing a legal counsel that reported to Joe within the CSO organization at Uber. Ultimately, Joe was indicted by the Justice Department for obstruction of justice, concealment of a felony, and wire fraud. So that didn't go great for him. And later on, the hackers were actually discovered that the $100,000 non-bug bounty had been paid to. They ended up actually extorting website lynda.com, the education website. And when they were caught extorting Lynda, they also confessed and pleaded guilty to the Uber hacks as well in 2019 when they were caught from the lynda.com hack. And to clarify, the 57 million records, that was 50 million customer records, 7 million drivers, and included things like names, emails, phone numbers, and over 600,000 United States driver's licenses. And these numbers are just astonishing for these side gig companies. And I wonder, putting my risk manager hat on, I think about these things a little differently. I'm like, the additional risk of having 7 million drivers' information. Now, I know they're not, quote, employees, but because they're contractors, that means you still have all of their personal and financial information in order to fulfill their contractual obligations. That wouldn't be like any other company. I mean, who has 7 million people's, quote, employee records, even though they're not employees? As I'm sure if my attorney were here, they would advise me to remind myself. But they still have the same information that you'd have on employees. So is this a risk that, your business structure needs to take into consideration as you're making your security and privacy planning, right? Because that's just such a large target painted on you for that level of detailed private information.
Well, there's a use case for storing this kind of information for drivers. They're getting random people in their vehicles. They're going to people's houses. You need to know who's operating your service and generating your revenue, right? So, and other industries do the same, just not to this kind of scale. And, I remember early in my career working for a huge mining and construction company, and there was a lot of contractors on that site. And we had to go through and pre-screen everybody before they ended up on a mine site or a rig offshore. It's standard business practice. It just comes down to how are you storing this? Have you written your own systems? And have you secured that information correctly? And time again, I think the answer for Uber is just a hard no, correct?
Yeah, and the FTC wasn't amused when they, of course, found out about the breach that happened while they were investigating the previous breach, and it wasn't disclosed. That's what led to Joe Sullivan being indicted because, again, the bureaucracy was quite unimpressed with you not thinking that was material to disclose. Mm-hmm. And so they had a new disclosure or a second settlement with Uber in September of 2018 that included the 2016 breach of the 57 million records. And in essence, I called it FTC settlement 2.0. It was pretty much the same as the 2017 settlement, except in addition to that, they fined Uber $148 million, which again sounds like a lot of money, but keep in mind in September of 2018, Uber was losing about $1 billion a quarter by selling their services for less than it cost to operate them. So $148 million fine, I guess you just throw it in the burn pile of cash.
It's still a lot of money though, and it does send a message. Like if you're a smaller startup and you were looking at doing something similar, if you wanted to do a competitor to Uber but ran far more ethically, you would look at this and say, you know what, we do need to treat that information because as a startup, if we're bootstrapping it especially, we don't have 148 million to just throw in the burn pile. So I get what you're saying, and I don't disagree with you that it's probably not a lot of money for Uber, but it does send a really strong message. And it's worth noting as well, the UK fined Uber for the same thing for, I think it was £385,000. And the Dutch DPA fined them as well, 600,000 euro for GDPR violations. So again, not a lot of money compared to what the FTC did, but it does send a message. We're in the age of startups. New startups are starting every day at the moment. If you look back at history, this is a good teachable moment for everybody to say, secure your systems, stop putting Uber credentials in your GitHub repositories, use multi-factor authentication against your code repositories. Otherwise, you're going to have to fork out a lot of money when a breach occurs. So from that perspective, Chet, like I said, I agree with you, but the money's not insignificant to people that are looking at this case and saying, well, we want to do similar. Let's not make the same mistakes as Uber.
Tell you what, I would provide this advice to them for 1% of the fine to prevent the next one.
Just 1%?
Yeah, 1% would be fine.
Okay.
So the good news is the breaches are getting further apart. So we're discussing the 2016 breach, and the next breach that I found, at least ones that were disclosed, was a third party, a cybersecurity firm called Cybele, discovered 579 customers' information and 100 Uber Eats drivers' information just hanging out on the dark web.
Yeah, I couldn't find a lot in this either, and the origins are unknown, but the fact that there are these records just sitting there somewhere on the dark web ready to be purchased or just downloaded is just concerning in itself, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of teachable moments in this one because we don't really know who stole the information from where to leak it to the dark web. Although it suggests it wasn't like a single driver or something because it included 100 different Uber Eats drivers' data. So it could have been a regional operator or. I mean, I have no idea what the business model is for the structure of a international company like Uber, but nonetheless, a baby breach after the 57 million records, which sets us up for, the breach of all breaches, at least so far when it comes to Uber. I'm not sure you could breach them more than this one, which was in September 15th, in fact, September 15th of 2022, not very long ago. The attackers announced that they broke into Uber. My favorite thing was they announced it on Slack. Like they broke into Uber, and in their Slack, they sent a message that said, "I announce I am a hacker and Uber has suffered a data breach." And I shouldn't laugh because this is terrible, but the guy's name is Teapot. And I understand you're quite a fan. You want us to tell us a little bit what Teapot was up to?
Yeah, I have in my notes, my man Teapot, because firstly, what an awesome hacker name, right? But I wouldn't say I'm a fan. At the end of the day, he's an 18-year-old cyber criminal that socially engineered Uber. It was interesting because they were openly bragging about what they did, not just in the internal Slack, but they were chatting to journalists via WhatsApp and Signal. And I remember at the time just seeing communication from some random person called Teapot bragging about what they did. And what was interesting is they were very blasé about how they did it, which was social engineering, as I said. But they really focused on multi-factor authentication fatigue.
There wasn't any social engineering.
Or was it not? It was social engineering. Well, it was multi-factor authentication fatigue that got around the initial login protections, right?
Right. But I don't know if I would call that social engineering because they purchased so what happened is a contractor of Uber had an info stealer on their laptop that was able to capture their Uber credentials when they were doing contract work for Uber. And those credentials ended up for sale on a marketplace on the dark web. And so Teapot was able to purchase that username and password off the dark web. But when we went to authenticate to the Uber VPN, the Uber VPN had Duo as their multi-factor authentication solution. And anybody that's used Duo in its default configuration, it's usually used as a push form of multi-factor, which is you have the app on your phone, you go to log into the website, it pops up on your phone, interrupts what you're doing and says, "This is Duo. I see you're trying to log into corp.uber.com from IP address 1.2.3.4 located in Buena Vista, California. Is this you?" Green button, yes, accept. Red button, no, deny.
I would consider that social engineering if, like, the whole idea behind the multi-factor authentication fatigue is you send an excessive amount of alerts. So someone says, "Oh, you know what? It's 3 a.m. I'm trying to sleep. My phone's vibrating next to my head. This must be a systems glitch. I'm just going to allow this." And then the person's logged into the system. So from that angle,
go away.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's fair. But all right, let's not call it.
Well, I guess it's a multimodal breach. Let's call it that because there was a stolen credential with from a piece of malware that enabled it to begin with, and then a purchase off the dark web, which is another component of it, and then there is the social component. I mean, there's all kinds of components here.
Let's just call it. We haven't
got the session cookie lifetimes yet.
Well, let's just call it a highly sophisticated attack and assume that we're writing a press release for it.
Well, okay, so let's go to this highly sophisticated attack because Teapot, our buddy Teapot, was a member of a cybercrime collective, if you want to call them that, on Telegram called The Calm. And for listeners that are familiar with the cybersecurity world, you may have seen people like Brian Krebs write a lot of information about this Telegram group. The Calm spawned multiple cybercrime groups. one of which was Lapsus, with $signs for S's, which is the group Teapot belonged to, and attributed the Uber attack to Lapsus. But in addition to that, the COM also, other members of the COM spun off into Scattered Spider, which had a whole series of high-profile hacks and breaches throughout 2022 and 2023, especially, again, all focused on that social engineering that you're talking about. Lots of social engineering in those attacks. And a more recent graduate of the COM that's been in the news headlines here in 2025 has been Edward Big Balls Korestein, who is one of Elon Musk's crew that are part of the Doge group that is working on alleged government efficiencies. So Big Balls apparently was buddies with Teapot at the COM, and so we got a little modern tie into this Uber story.
Yeah, it's funny how these things interweave, but we've seen this, and I don't want to go on too much of a side tangent.
Oh, don't even bring weave into this.
But it's funny how these cyber criminals just tend to float from group to group to group, and we've seen, like, you know, geopolitical conflicts cause groups to split, so people that were previously working together are now separate. And you know, it's funny how a lot of these cybercrime groups are also like phoenixes. You know, they're suddenly gone one day, then they rise from the ashes with a different name, same bit of malware, and away they go again. So Teapot was certainly in some interesting circles, but one thing I want to talk about with him is he managed to authenticate against the VPN concentrator at Uber, which essentially gave him complete remote access to Uber's network. So there wasn't a lot of access controls around a VPN concentrator. And to give those non-technical listeners a bit of an idea here, when you connect via VPN to an organization, so a virtual private network, which essentially gives you remote access to an organization, there should be access controls to say, okay, you work in, say, accounting, or you work in IT, you only need to access these systems when you are logged in remotely, and you should only get access to those systems. What happened with this breach that was interesting is Teapot logged in, and he could scan the network and had access to everything. And when I say everything, he was posting screenshots of AWS consoles, of Google Drive, of internal databases, source code repositories, internal financial documents, and employee information. And he was screenshotting all of this and putting it on the internet in real time, bragging about it.
Don't forget about the Sentinel-1 screenshots and VMware vSphere as well.
That's true, yeah.
Sentinel-1 is their EDR platform, and, like, you know, not great. But how he got access to all that was, to me, the interesting bit, which is when he got in initially, he discovered there were login scripts in a login share. And in that share, there were PowerShell scripts that included the domain admin password to Thycotic, their privileged access management system. And I find some irony in this, in that the FTC fined them and yelled at them twice for not having privileged access management. So they implemented privileged access management, and then they stored the admin password for it in a login script.
Yeah, not ideal. I will say, having passwords in a script is a very common sysadmin mistake. I think it's happening less and less now, but there's always a admin dollar share on a Windows network where you can find something juicy. That's just part of life as a Windows administrator. Not that I condone that behavior, Chet. But then going back to Teapot, he was bragging about it, but it was really just for lols. And what I mean by that is it doesn't look like he stole anything. As in, he didn't exfiltrate anything out of the network. It was just, I managed to breach Uber. He was like my golden retriever at the park collecting sticks. Just getting them all, bringing them back to me to say, look at what I've got. This is the best day ever. But didn't actually do anything with it, which I just find highly peculiar in 2022 when active adversaries are rampant, encrypting systems, demanding huge ransoms. It doesn't seem like that's what Teapot wanted.
No, but that was a bit of a trademark of Lapsus and Scattered Spider, right? I mean, when there was some teenage level thing to get, they would, like they broke into, and presumably it may have been Teapot, Rockstar Games, and tried to steal some of the early game footage of Grand Theft Auto. What are we on, 6? I don't even know. I think it's 6 that was the unreleased version of Grand Theft Auto. So that was a very teenager weird motive move to break into a company. They also broke into NVIDIA and stole like GPU design plans and tried to sell them to AMD as if as if that was going to be a thing. I think it was all for the lulz, man.
Yeah, I don't.
I mean, some artful trolling, some really artful trolling.
Yeah, I don't know about you though, Chet. I really miss hacking for the lols. I've always found it amusing, somewhat, which is terrible of me as a security professional. But it's so much.
We're gonna have to do an episode on Hector Monseeger.
So yeah. Anyway, Teapot really did a great job here. He got the message across. He got famous. He's got a cool hacker name. I would never have gone with that. I did find that I believe he's got British origins. So the fact that you've got British origins and you've got the hacker name Teapot, super cool. Very patriotic. I love it.
Well, let's jump back into the timeline. So in October of 2022, about a month after the giant Lapsus breach, Joe Sullivan was convicted of 2 felonies. He ultimately was convicted of obstruction of justice and misprision of a felony. And that's a bit of a legal term of art, but misprision of a felony is an incredibly fancy way of saying you aided and abetted someone in committing a crime, or you covered up a crime. So you have an obligation to report a felony, and instead you paid an extortion fee to hide it. And no, you're not supposed to do that. Now, the wheels of justice move slowly in the United States of America, so I'm going to skip ahead in the timeline for a second. Joe was ultimately sentenced in May of 2023, about 5 months later, and he received a 3-year sentence of probation in addition to a $50,000 US dollar fine. And that's been an incredibly controversial conviction in the CISO community, because some people are very defensive of pressing criminal charges against CISOs for doing things that allegedly or arguably could be in the best interest of their organizations, which is one of their legal obligations, their shareholders and their businesses. But in this case, they were felonies, and he was a former assistant U.S. U.S. attorney, which kind of suggests that you might have knew it wasn't legal. And the compromise for this white-collar crime was 3 years probation and a $50,000 fine.
Hefty fine. Again, probation means you don't go to prison. You're just not allowed to break any more laws. And during that 3-year period. So I actually think he got off quite lightly, between you and I and all of our listeners. But I actually think this is really important. This is the role of a C-level executive. You do have responsibilities. And if you made the call to blatantly break the law, he was a district attorney, correct? He knows the law. You don't pay off cyber criminals. You don't bribe cyber criminals. Again, let's use this as a landmark case to be like, well, don't do what Joe Sullivan did. You don't want to get a $148 million fine for insecuring your AWS credentials. This is all just part of the learnings. You can learn a lot over Uber's short history.
Yeah, there's a line in the sand there that's quite clear. Don't commit felonies while trying to protect your businesses from cybercrime. And I think I guess if you're Canadian and you don't like Joe Sullivan, this is a good thing, because now that he's a convicted felon, he won't be able to come to Canada. But the part I think that disappointed me, I don't really have too strong of an opinion about whether the sentence was right or not. I think it's important that you're convicted when you commit a felony, and that's the most important part, to draw that line in the sand of saying this is not okay. But Travis Kalanick sounds like he directed Joe in these activities as CEO of the company, and I was quite disappointed to see that all of the weight of justice came down on Joe and not on the CEO who was involved in directing this, and sounds like colluded to specifically hide this from their lawyers. And I think Travis had some responsibility, and it's unfair to pin this all on Joe.
Yeah, totally agree. But that wasn't the end of Uber's history of leaking.
Oh, we're almost there, though. We're almost there.
Yeah, sorry. I felt like we could have put a bow on it there, but we're not quite there yet, are we?
No, just a couple small ones. in December of 2022, a third party, a company named Tectivity. From what I gather, they specialize in IT asset management as a service. So like they will figure out which employees you've provisioned an iPhone or an Android or a laptop or this kind of stuff. But of course, that requires them to collect a fair bit of information from your employees, like their home address in this work from home age, especially in 2022 when this breach happened. We're kind of coming out of the pandemic where a lot of people still working from home, maybe forever. But even if they had to return to work, they had a lot of equipment shipped to them, this kind of stuff. They had a breach and lost some of that employee information. I think it was mostly things like addresses where devices had been shipped and what items and maybe IMEI numbers of devices and, this sorts of thing, which probably not terribly useful for identity theft. But anytime you're leaking something like a physical address, you may be putting people at risk that have domestic abuse situations. You don't know what's going on in people's lives, and it's never great that this information be made public.
Yeah, like just to quantify it though, Believing Computers reported that there was a list of 77,000 Uber employees. Like, that's a lot of employee information leaked. But the total leak file was 600 meg, and it was being advertised on the dark web as an Uber breach as well, right? So whoever was responsible for that breach were trying to capitalize and make money on that straight away. It was only 600 meg worth of data, which in hindsight's not a lot anymore, but it was up for sale almost immediately.
I had a 144 kilobyte floppy disk in my hand recently, and I will say 600 megabytes is a lot of data.
Well, it's all a matter of perspective, I guess. So
it certainly is. And we'll wrap with their final breach. We should clarify as of April 2nd, 2025, which was one of their law firms was breached and had information. It sounds like specifically on drivers who did trips in and out of the state of New Jersey in the United States. Their personal information that was involved in a legal case was stolen from the law firm. Now, these kinds of things, it's, I think, unfair and almost impossible to blame Uber for when you're dealing with third parties. It's certain kinds of confidential information are going to be shared with your law firm. How you can ensure that law firm's security, good luck. I mean, we all have audits and policies and procedures that we try to follow when we're onboarding partners and vendors, especially those that have access to sensitive information, but nobody's perfect.
Totally agree. And we do see a lot now where a lot of people are starting to implement third-party auditing and asking third parties how they're securing information, what are they doing for security practices. And if you look at a lot of frameworks now, like NIST, part of governance is also, supplier identification. So, but at the end of the day, there's only so much you can control, and this one was out of reach for Uber. It's not their fault. But one thing that I do want to talk about today, and just briefly, because I know we're running quite long today, chat, there are 5 or 6 breaches we've discussed where there's been loss of both customer, employee, and driver information for Uber. One thing that's quite evident is that there's been no reputational damage throughout all of this. It doesn't matter how bad the breach is. Nobody stopped using Uber except for maybe you and I. I can't actually use Uber where I live. I bugged out of the city a few years ago. But all in all, there's no real reputational hit that's occurred. People continue to use Uber. It just seems like it's a fact of life. And for me, I find that really, really alarming. I don't know if it's just due to the lack of competitors in the market or if it's just, they're just so dominant. You just have to live with it and say, well, whatever Uber do with their practices, it is what it is.
Well, you didn't make light of, but you took lightly more than I did you implied maybe more strongly the $148 million fine. And I think that's where the rubber meets the road. That maybe that's $1 billion fine. I don't know what it takes to actually get their attention. But if the market can't fix this, then the regulator must, right? And I think this is where, and this is probably getting too political, and that's not really the point of our podcast, but in my personal opinion, in dealing with the new SEC rules around breach disclosure, more and more legal things are entering into the office of the CISO. And we have to be smart about the law and rules and regulations. And there's a lot of pushback that the law can't keep up with information security because it's moving so fast. And I agree with that. Like, it's really hard to write a prescriptive regulation or law to keep up with the fast changing pace of our industry. But where the free market fails, the regulator must step in. And in what you're telling me is the free market has failed because it's not corrected for a company that's clearly not shown the respect that's due their customers and their staff. And in that case, regulations and fines are the way to get the attention of companies to stay on the straight and narrow path. I hope, and I know lots and lots of people pay very close attention to Joe Sullivan's conviction, and it's probably changed some minds about how to handle information security, and that's a good thing. It's bad for Joe that he had to be the proof point, but others have learned from that. To do the equivalent to a business, it needs to be financial, because we can't put Uber itself in jail. We can't give Uber the probationary. I mean, you kind of have with the FTC ruling of requiring them to get bi-yearly privacy audits for 20 years. But to me, that, if we want to see more impact, then these are the situations where, when it's clear the market hasn't worked, some external force has to be brought to bear.
Totally agree. And on that note, I think that's a perfect way to close, Chet.
It certainly is. We appreciate you joining us here on this podcast. We hope you found this information educational and useful. We're all over the place. We try to post things everywhere because we want to reach a great audience, and we do this for you ad-free because we just love talking about these things. So spread the word for us, if you will. You can join us on YouTube at www.youtube.com/@securitytake2. Of course, our website is securitytake2two.com. Hosts at securitytake2.com will get you our email if you want to give us any feedback directly or tell us off. And we have a Reddit, not very active Reddit, but there's a Reddit out there.
I still post the show notes, and if you ever make a comment, I will see it. So if you go to reddit.com/r/securitytake2, TWO, you will find our show notes and a link to the website there.